trap and the gathering. The outboard motor coughed once, a wet, metallic death rattle, before the propeller snagged on something submerged and jagged. The skiff lurched violently, spinning in the black water of the channel until it groaned against the barnacle-crusted pilings of the island's rotted pier. Sarah gripped the gunwale, her knuckles white. She looked at the 6 teenagers huddled in the boat with them. They were armed with little more than baseball bats, heavy-duty flashlights, and a reckless, adolescent belief in their own invincibility. "The engine's dead," Sarah said, her voice tight. She kept her eyes on the tree line, that impenetrable wall of pine and gnarled oak that seemed to lean over the beach, hungry for them. "So?" Mike, the quarterback, shrugged, shifting his weight. "We fix it later. We get Rachel, we get back. It's just an island, Sarah. Chill." "You don't understand," Sarah hissed, standing up. The boat bobbed, unsteady. "This isn't a game. We aren't here for a party. We're here to save her," another friend, Chloe, whispered, clutching a cross she'd pulled from her grandmother's jewelry box. She looked terrified, but determined. "We have the numbers, right? Like you said, Sarah. We're a pack." Sarah climbed onto the dock. The wood was slick with midnight doing something else, something sticky and dark. She looked down and saw a streak of brownish-red crusted into the grain. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She signaled for the others to follow, her movements jerky, frantic. As the group scrambled onto the pier, the silence of the island hit them, a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to vacuum the sound out of their footsteps. There were no crickets, no breeze in the leaves. Just the rhythmic, wet slap of the tide against the pilings. "Wait," Sarah commanded, freezing mid-step. She pulled a heavy flashlight from her pack and swept the beam across the beach. The skiff they had arrived in wasn't just dead, it was butchered. The fuel line had been sheared clean, not by rust, but by something sharp enough to slice through reinforced rubber like butter. The hull was punctured. They weren't just visitors, they were cargo that had been delivered to a butcher block. "Sarah?" Mike's voice lacked its earlier bravado. "The boat, it looks like it was ripped open." "Keep moving," Sarah whispered. "Don't stop. Don't look back." They trudged toward the tree line. The forest path was narrow, choked with encroaching thorns that snagged at their jeans and hoodies. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. Then, the shadows moved. It wasn't a sudden attack. It was a ripple in the darkness, a fluid shifting of figures that hung just at the periphery of their light. One moment, the woods were empty, the next, the air turned freezing, tasting of ozone and copper. "Did you hear that?" Chloe whimpered. Click. The sound came from above. A laugh, thin and melodic, drifted down from the canopy. "Run!" Sarah screamed. The group shattered. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized the boys who had been so eager to play hero. Mike sprinted toward the mansion's silhouette, his flashlight beam cutting erratic, useless arcs through the trees. Sarah tried to grab his arm, but he was gone, propelled by the blind, panicked instinct of prey. The transition from a rescue mission to a hunt was instantaneous. The woods seemed to warp around them, the path twisting into a labyrinth. Every time Sarah turned to check on the others, the forest felt narrower, the darkness deeper. "Sarah! Help!" The scream came from behind them, swallowed abruptly by a wet, tearing sound. It was cut off so sharply it didn't even echo. "Keep going." Sarah shoved the remaining 3 toward the house. The mansion rose out of the gloom, a jagged, Victorian monstrosity of rotting wood and shattered glass. It wasn't a shelter, it was a cage. The windows, dark and hollow, looked like the eyes of a skull watching them approach. They burst out of the tree line and onto the overgrown lawn. The mansion's front door stood slightly ajar, inviting them in with a gap that looked like a hungry mouth. "We need to get inside," Sarah breathed, panting, her lungs burning. She looked back one last time. The forest was absolutely still again. No birds, no wind, no sounds of struggle. Just the suffocating, heavy silence. "Sarah, where are the others?" Chloe asked, trembling so hard her teeth chattered. Sarah looked at the house. She knew, with a sickening, cold clarity, that the vampires were hurting them. They were playing with the perimeter, pushing them toward the house like cattle toward a chute. She had brought them here to save Rachel, but in her naivety, she had only provided a fresh harvest. "Inside," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "Get inside and lock the door." They crossed the threshold into the foyer. The air inside was warm and smelled of dried herbs and iron. As soon as they were all within the grand hall, the heavy oak door slammed shut behind them with the finality of a coffin lid. It didn't just close, it clicked with an unnatural, electromagnetic hum. Sarah grabbed the handle and wrenched at it. It didn't budge. She pounded her shoulder against it, but it felt like stone. She spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping the room. The foyer was grand, filled with velvet drapes and portraits whose subjects seemed to follow them with eyes of oil and canvas. In the center of the room, on a marble pedestal, sat an old, leather-bound book, open to a page pulsing with a faint, bioluminescent glow. "We shouldn't be here," one of the boys whispered, backing away from the pedestal. "We're not alone," Sarah said, raising her flashlight. From the shadows of the grand staircase, a figure emerged. Tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, with eyes that caught the light like polished glass. Mark. He didn't look like a monster, he looked like a guest at a gala, relaxed and predatory. He tipped an imaginary hat to them, his smile wide and teeth bright. "Welcome, guests. The house has been so dreadfully quiet since we finished with the first one." He gestured toward the shadows behind him. A girl stepped out, Rachel. But she was different. Her skin was the color of moonlight, her movements unnervingly precise, and her eyes held a jagged, fractured intelligence that wasn't human. She looked at Sarah, and for a split second, there was a flash of recognition, a ghost of the girl Sarah had grown up with, before it was replaced by a hollow, predatory void. "Rachel?" Sarah whispered, her heart turning to ice. Rachel didn't answer. She only tilted her head, her nostrils flaring as if catching a scent. "She doesn't remember the playground, Sarah," Mark chuckled, stepping down the stairs. "She's evolved. She's hungry. And you've brought us such a lovely, disorganized buffet." Sarah backed into the center of the foyer, her friends huddled behind her. She realized then, with a devastating sense of finality, that there was no way out. The house wasn't just a building, it was an engine, and it had been waiting for them to turn the key. The hunt had stopped. The slaughter was about to begin. The heavy oak doors of the mansion groaned inward as if exhaling a stale, centuries-old breath. The entrance hall was a cavern of rotted velvet and floor-to-ceiling shadows, but it wasn't the darkness that stopped the group cold, it was the silence. The chaotic, panicked running they had done through the woods, the crashing brush, the ragged breathing of their friends, died the moment they crossed the threshold. Rachel felt the air pressure shift. It was a physical weight, like the sudden, crushing depth of a swimming pool. Beside her, Sarah's fingers were white-knuckled around the strap of her bag, her eyes darting across the flickering shadows of the foyer. "They're not here," one of the boys whispered, his voice trembling. "Maybe they left? Maybe we can just find Rachel and go." Before the words could fully settle, the heavy doors slammed shut with a finality that shook the floorboards. The sound wasn't just metal on wood, it was the sound of a lock clicking into place in a cosmic sense. The chandeliers overhead erupted into a sickly, amber light, fueled by something that smelled faintly of ozone and old blood. From the grand staircase, a figure descended with a grace that was sickeningly smooth. Mark. He looked exactly as he had in the woods, the same predatory red hair, the same jagged, cruel grin, but tonight, he wasn't hunting. He was hosting. "Welcome," Mark drawled, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. "We were worried you'd lost your way." It would have been a shame to miss the final guests. Sarah took a step forward, raising her voice, though the tremor in her hands betrayed her. "Where is she? Where is Rachel?" Mark tilted his head, his eyes glowing with an internal, flickering fire. He didn't look at Sarah. He looked at the shadows behind her, his gaze fixated on the group of terrified teenagers shivering in the center of the room. "She's waiting for the conclusion of the evening, just as you are. But first, let's see what you're made of." With a sudden, violent flick of his wrist, the room seemed to warp. The floorboards beneath them didn't just creak, they shifted, yawning open into narrow, dark crevices that forced the group to scatter. A fine, violet mist, a glamour, heavy and cloying, poured from the walls, smelling of pressed lilies and rot. "Split them up," a voice commanded from the darkness. It was David. He didn't appear, he simply spoke from everywhere at once, his voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated in their marrow. The panic was no longer an external threat, it became an internal infection. Rachel, who had been held captive in the library, heard the screams of her friends echoing through the vents, and it tore at her soul. She strained against the silver-wrought chains binding her to the wall, her lungs burning. She couldn't see them, but she could hear the precise moment the terror set in. The sound of a boy pleading, followed by the wet, sickening sound of a struggle, and then, silence. In the foyer, Sarah watched in horror as the shadows themselves seemed to solidify, wrapping around her friends like liquid tar. David's influence was absolute. He wasn't just killing them, he was dismantling their minds. He made the room expand and contract, tricking their eyes, isolating them in pockets of darkness where they were forced to confront their worst fears in solitude. "Don't listen to him," Sarah screamed, clawing at a barrier of invisible energy that kept her pinned to the grand staircase. "Stay together. Don't let him inside your heads." "But he's already there, little bird," Mark whispered, stepping out of the gloom directly behind her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a cold blade against her neck. "He's in their memories. He's in their regrets. Why fight the inevitable? You brought them here to die, didn't you? It was your idea. Your dare." Sarah's breath hitched. The guilt hit her harder than any physical blow. She had been the one to push, she had been the one to insist that they come back. She looked down at the floor, where the shadows were swirling, showing her glimpses of her friends. One boy cowering in a corner, hallucinating that his own hands were blades, another girl staring into a mirror that didn't reflect her face, but a hollowed-out skull. "This is the price of curiosity," David's voice boomed, triumphant and cold. Rachel, chained in the dark, wept. She could feel the connection being severed, one by one, the lifelights of her friends were being snuffed out, not just by death, but by the psychological shredding David was orchestrating. He was feeding on their fear, his power swelling with every spike of adrenaline and every sob of despair. The foyer became a theater of cruelty. Mark wandered through the scattered survivors, not even bothering to strike them down, simply whispering into their ears, watching as they clawed at their own clothes, driven into a state of dissociative breakdown. Sarah fell to her knees, the crushing weight of the glamour pinning her to the floorboards. She looked toward the ceiling, searching for any sign of escape, but the house had turned against them. The architecture was shifting, moving, closing in like the ribs of a giant, ancient beast. "They aren't just guests anymore," Mark laughed, his voice a jagged edge of delight. "They are fuel." Rachel finally broke her chains, not through strength, but through a primal, desperate surge of vampiric hunger she didn't yet understand. She lunged into the hallway, her vision burning with a crimson hue, seeing the world in currents of heat and fear. She saw Sarah in the foyer, broken and sobbing, and the sight ignited a fire in her blood. She wasn't human anymore. She realized it then, with a terrifying clarity. The humanity she was fighting to protect was being systematically erased, replaced by a cold, sharpened instinct. She sprinted toward the foyer, the wood of the house splintering under her feet, fueled by a rage that felt older than the island itself. But as she reached the threshold of the grand room, she stopped. David stood in the center, his eyes fixed on the remaining, whimpering survivors. He wasn't looking at her, but he knew she was there. He raised a hand, and the house groaned. The floorboards beneath the survivors vanished, dropping them into the pitch-black void of the basement, leaving only the sound of their terrified screams spiraling down, down, down into the heart of the island. The silence returned, heavier and more suffocating than before. David turned to look at Rachel, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. "You see, Rachel? The tragedy isn't that they died. The tragedy is that you let them believe you could save them." He gestured to Mark, who stood by the basement trapdoor, his hands dripping with a dark, viscous substance. "The ritual requires a specific kind of despair. You've provided it in abundance. Now, we begin." The foyer of the mansion was a cavern of rotted velvet and shadow, a cavernous space that felt less like a room and more like the throat of a beast. The heavy oak doors had slammed shut with a finality that vibrated through the soles of Rachel's sneakers, the sound of iron bolts sliding home echoing like a gunshot. Rachel spun around, her breath hitching. Beside her, Sarah was already back to back, her knuckles white as she gripped a makeshift crowbar she'd salvaged from the boat. They were alone. The frantic shouts of their classmates, the calls for help, the desperate whimpers, had been cut off the moment they stepped over the threshold. The house had swallowed them, isolating the two girls in the center of the foyer's intricate, blood-red mosaic floor. "They're gone," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Rachel, where are they?" "They were right behind us." It's a funnel, Rachel realized, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. She scanned the grand, sweeping staircase and the darkened archways that led into the bowels of the house. Every instinct she possessed, every shred of logic that had brought them here, was screaming that they had walked into a slaughterhouse. They weren't chasing us. They were hurting us. A soft, rhythmic clapping emerged from the shadows above. Mark stepped onto the velvet runner of the landing, his red hair vivid against the decaying wallpaper. He leaned over the banister, his grin wide, showing teeth that seemed too sharp, too white for a human mouth. Behind him, Jack stood like a silent, Irish statue, his eyes reflecting the dim amber light of the chandeliers. "A performance," Mark called down, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "Honestly, I haven't been this entertained in decades. Do you know how hard it is to get fresh blood to walk through the front door of their own volition? Where are our friends?" Sarah stepped forward, her defiance sharp despite the terror radiating off her in waves. "Let them go, Mark. We're here. Isn't that what you wanted?" Mark laughed, a dry, rasping sound. He hopped over the banister, landing with impossible grace on the foyer floor. He didn't walk, he glided, the air around him seeming to chill as he approached. "Oh, Sarah. Sweet, protective Sarah. You think this is a trade? A hostage negotiation?" Mark stopped just out of arm's reach. "You are the centerpieces. The others, they were merely the appetizers. The catalyst. You needed to feel the loss, the pure, unfiltered dread of failing them. That terror, that spike of adrenaline? It makes the blood so much sweeter. It gives the transformation a vintage quality." Rachel felt a cold sweat break out on her neck. "Transformation? David wants heirs, not corpses," Mark whispered, stepping into her personal space. He smelled of ozone and stagnant water. "He needs vessels that have been broken, gutted of their innocence, and then refilled with something darker. And you too, with your little dare, with your stubborn curiosity, you're the perfect clay." From the shadows, the foyer began to shift. The walls groaned, and the floorboards beneath them seemed to pulse. David emerged from the darkness under the staircase, his presence heavy and suffocating. He didn't look like a monster, he looked like a scholar, his suit impeccable, his eyes holding the ancient, hollow light of someone who had watched empires fall and found them boring. "The ritual requires a catalyst of grief," David said, his voice echoing with a resonance that wasn't entirely human. "You saw them taken. You heard their screams. You felt the futility of your attempt to save them. That, Rachel, is the threshold. Rachel tried to swing her flashlight at him, but the beam flickered and died. The darkness in the room seemed to congeal, thick and liquid. "We're not going to be your puppets," Rachel hissed, though she felt the unnatural pull of the room trying to drag her knees to the floor. "You already are," David replied, gesturing with a slow, elegant sweep of his hand. Suddenly, the floor beneath the girls gave way, not into a hole, but into a shimmering, black veil of energy. The house wasn't just a building, it was an anchor, a tether between worlds. The floor dissolved into a swirling vortex of shadow that rose up to consume them. Sarah grabbed Rachel's hand, her grip bruising. "Don't let go. I've got you," Rachel shouted, but the world had tilted sideways. The foyer fell away, replaced by the crushing weight of the cellar below, a place that reeked of iron and ancient decay. They hit the stone floor hard, the impact knocking the wind from their lungs. Before they could scramble up, invisible restraints pinned them to the center of a circular altar etched into the floor. The room was lit by a ring of black candles that burned with a sickly, violet flame. Around the perimeter, the shadows of their friends moved, not as people, but as puppets. They stood in rigid, unnatural poses, their eyes vacant, their movements stiff and jerky. They were already thralls, shells emptied of their souls to fuel the magic that was now tightening like a noose around Rachel and Sarah. Mark descended the cellar stairs, his boots clicking rhythmically against the stone. He held a jagged, obsidian dagger that seemed to absorb the light around it. "The dare," David murmured, his voice sounding as if it were coming from inside their own skulls. "You wanted to see the truth of this island. You wanted to know what happened to the people who went missing." "Rachel, look at me," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Her voice was cracked, shattered. "Don't look at them. Look at me." "I can't," Rachel sobbed, the words being torn from her throat. She could feel the darkness seeping into her skin, a freezing cold that felt like liquid nitrogen pouring into her veins. Her senses were sharpening. She could hear the beating of Mark's heart, a slow, predatory thrum. She could hear the rustle of the ancient dust on the ceiling. She could hear the cessation of hope. "The ritual isn't about killing you," David whispered, leaning over them, his hand hovering over Rachel's forehead. "It's about ending the human experiment. It's about making you eternal, whether you want it or not." Mark stepped forward, the obsidian dagger tracing a line through the air, sending sparks of dark energy falling like snow onto the altar. First, the bite. Then, the integration. And then, you'll thank us for liberating you from the fragile mortality you're so desperate to cling to. Rachel looked up at the ceiling, seeing the cracks in the stone, the history of thousands of sacrifices etched into the foundation of the house. She realized then that they weren't the first, and they wouldn't be the last. But as the pain flared, a searing, white-hot agony as Mark's shadow touched her, a sudden, primal instinct flared in the back of her mind. It wasn't humanity. It wasn't logic. It was a predatory hunger, a sudden, blinding realization that if she was going to be a monster, she wouldn't be their monster. "Sarah," Rachel choked out, her voice changing, deepening, becoming something sharp and metallic. "Fight it. When I scream, don't look back." "Rachel, no. Do it." The dagger descended. The foyer, the island, the boat, the school, all the memories of the girl she had been that morning began to dissolve, replaced by the cold, infinite reach of the shadow. The ritual reached its crescendo, the house shrieking in a symphony of tortured wood and dying light. Rachel's scream ripped through the cellar, but it wasn't a scream of surrender. It was the sound of a new, apex predator waking up in the dark.